Hey guys, tonight we drift into a mystery that burned through the pages of time, literally. A house fire in the hills of West Virginia back in 1945 changed one family forever. It was Christmas Eve. The flames devoured almost everything, except the questions. 5 children vanished that night. Not a trace, not a sound, not a single clue that truly explained what happened. And here's the haunting part. The fire alone shouldn't have made them disappear. There were no remains, no bones, no ash piles, just silence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The town was Fayetteville, quiet, modest, wrapped in Appalachian charm where everyone knew each other's business and the mountains seemed to hold their secrets close. The Sodder family had lived there for over 2 decades. George and Jenny Sodder, immigrants who built a life brick by brick. George ran a successful trucking company. Jenny took care of the home and their 10 children. That night, December 24th, 1945, the house was warm with the scent of pine, Christmas baking, and the muffled laughter of children. Gifts were wrapped, lights strung, stockings hung. 9 of the 10 children were home. The oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military. The others, they were safe, together, under one roof. Or so it seemed. The evening unfolded peacefully. The children stayed up late, playing with toys, begging to keep the lights on just a little longer. Jenny agreed. She went to bed with the younger kids upstairs, while George and the older boys drifted off one by one. Midnight came and went, and then the silence cracked.
It began with a strange sound. Jenny, asleep upstairs, was stirred from her dreams by a loud, sharp noise, something like a heavy object hitting the roof, followed by a rolling, scraping echo. She sat up, heart fluttering, listening, but the night had gone still again. No shouting, no footsteps, just the whisper of wind through December trees. She waited. Nothing. Perhaps it was snow sliding off the eaves, or just her imagination. Eventually, she lay back down. But then, minutes later, the scent reached her. Smoke. Jenny shot up. She raced down the stairs, the floorboards cool and quiet underfoot, until she turned the corner and saw flames blooming from the office room near the telephone and fuse box. She shouted for George, who bolted from bed. The fire was already climbing the walls, lapping up the dry wooden panels like kindling. They had no time. George and Jenny began waking the children. 2 of the older sons, John and George Jr., managed to escape. Sylvia, the youngest, just 2 years old, was carried out by Jenny. Another daughter, Marion, had already gotten out. But 5 children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were nowhere to be seen. They had been sleeping in the attic bedroom. Flames were blocking the stairwell. George tried to reach them. He broke a window and sliced open his arm. Smoke and heat forced him back. The fire was swallowing the house with terrifying speed. They tried everything. George sprinted to the side of the house where a ladder was usually propped, but it was missing. He looked for his trucks. He thought to drive one next to the house to climb into the attic. Neither truck would start, though both had been running perfectly the day before. They even tried drawing water from a rain barrel to douse the flames, but it was frozen solid. Within 45 minutes, the Sodder home collapsed into a smoldering ruin, and the 5 children inside, gone.
The morning after the fire, what should have been a solemn process of sifting through ashes for closure instead became the beginning of decades of doubt. By sunrise, neighbors and relatives had gathered. drawn by the scent of char and the weight of unimaginable loss. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the blackened remains of the house like an ironic attempt to cleanse the tragedy. Yet even then, something felt off. Authorities were quick to arrive, but they moved with a strange haste. Within hours, the fire chief, F.J. Morris, suggested the blaze had been caused by faulty wiring. A convenient explanation, and he claimed the children's bodies had been, quote, completely cremated in the fire. That explanation did not sit well with Jenny. She had read obsessively in the days that followed, searching for any case where house fires had incinerated entire skeletons. She even wrote to a local crematorium. The answer was clear. Human bones do not simply vanish, not in a house fire. Even at temperatures much higher than what the Sodder home had endured, bone fragments remained. Yet no bones, no teeth, no skulls were found. And there was more. The family's Christmas lights, Jenny remembered, had stayed on well into the fire, meaning the wiring likely wasn't the issue. And George had recently had the electrical system inspected and approved. Then there were the phone calls. On the night of the fire, at around midnight, just before Jenny heard the loud thud on the roof, the phone had rung. She answered, confused. On the other end, a woman asked for someone Jenny didn't recognize. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed in the background. Jenny told her she had the wrong number. The woman laughed again, softly, before hanging up. Why would someone prank call them at midnight on Christmas Eve? And what about the ladder? It was found later, oddly, at the bottom of an embankment, more than 70 feet away from the house. The missing trucks? Both were tested days later and started instantly. Within a week, the official stance was declared: no foul play, no further investigation needed. The 5 children, they said, had perished, and that was that. But the Sodders knew it wasn't.
Grief has a way of carving tunnels in the mind, some leading to memories, others to obsession. For the Sodders, it tunneled into something deeper: suspicion. Not just that something had gone wrong that night, but that someone had made it happen. In the weeks that followed, they began retracing every detail, seeking out anything that might have slipped past in the haze of tragedy. That's when the oddities began stacking up, one after another, like clues in a mystery novel that no one else seemed eager to read. A few months before the fire, a man claiming to be a life insurance salesman had stopped by the house. When George politely declined his services, the man turned oddly hostile. His parting words: that the house would go up in smoke and George's children would be destroyed because of the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. George was known in the local Italian immigrant community for his outspoken criticism of Mussolini. It wasn't just political banter. He despised the fascist leader and made no secret of it. In post-war West Virginia, where loyalties still ran deep, this could have stirred more than just uncomfortable conversation. Not long after, another stranger showed up to inspect a fuse box George had just had installed. He told the family it would cause a fire someday. George found it suspicious. The wiring had been cleared by the electric company, and no issues had ever occurred. And there was the incident with the older Sodder boys. In early December, just weeks before the fire, a man had been parked along Route 16, watching the children return from school. He asked around town about them. No one knew who he was or why he was so interested. All of these moments, once brushed off as strange but meaningless, now took on new weight. Then came the eyewitnesses. A woman claimed she'd seen the missing Sodder children peering out of a car window that very night as the house burned behind them. Another, at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, swore she had served breakfast to a group of children matching their descriptions, accompanied by 2 adults who looked Italian. The adults didn't let the children speak and acted nervously when asked questions. Local police dismissed the accounts. Grief, they said, wishful thinking. But the Sodders were not imagining things. The puzzle pieces weren't imagined, they were real. The pattern was emerging, and it pointed away from fire and toward something far more deliberate.
The deeper they dug, the more unstable the official story became. Fire, as an explanation, depended on the assumption that the 5 missing children had died in the blaze and were simply unrecognizable, that nothing remained, that bone and ash had vanished together in a house fire so intense that no trace of human remains could be recovered. But science, and reality, disagreed. George and Jenny took it upon themselves to consult professionals. A crematorium technician told them that even at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, human bones do not completely incinerate. A 2-hour cremation leaves behind fragments, dense, unmistakable evidence of a body. The Sodder house, by contrast, had burned for only about 45 minutes before it collapsed. And yet, no bones were found, not a single tooth, not a shard of skull. To test this themselves, Jenny conducted her own experiment. She burned animal bones, chicken, beef, pork, on the stove in the backyard. Every time, something remained. Every time she could hold the truth in her hands. And then came the curious case of the appliances. Several large items like the family's refrigerator and stove had survived the fire in a recognizable state. Not intact, of course, but present, not obliterated. The thought haunted Jenny. If metal endured, how could bones, far more resilient than flesh, disappear completely? Then they found more. A telephone repairman inspected the line that had gone dead the night of the fire. It had been severed, not burned, but cut, and not at the house, but roughly 14 feet up the utility pole. George, determined to uncover the truth, hired a private investigator. He returned with a shocking claim. The life insurance salesman who had threatened George before the fire had also served on the coroner's jury that declared the fire accidental. Conflict of interest was putting it mildly. At the same time, a letter arrived. It was from a woman in St. Louis who claimed the oldest missing girl, Martha, was being held in a convent. Another reported sighting came from Texas. Children resembling the Sodders were seen at a hotel with unfamiliar adults. George followed every lead. He traveled, he questioned, he begged for clarity. But each road ended in mist, or silence, or doors that wouldn't open. Theories began to grow like ivy along the ruins. Kidnapping, mafia involvement, retaliation for George's political views, a botched adoption. Each one had holes, yes, but so did the official explanation. And while the world slowly forgot the story, the Sodders couldn't, because the house had collapsed, but their doubts stood strong.
Desperation led George to drastic measures. By the spring of 1947, more than a year had passed since the fire. Hope should have been shrinking, but for the Sodders, it was morphing into something more dangerous: obsession. George was no longer just a grieving father. He had become a man on a mission, one who could not rest until the question that haunted every corner of his home had an answer. Where were his children? He bulldozed the site of the ruined house, dug into the basement himself, turning over every clump of ash and dirt. At one point, he unearthed what looked like an object of interest, a small piece of what might have been human vertebra. Hope surged, but only briefly. He sent the fragment to a specialist in Washington, D.C. The analysis was clear. The bone had never been exposed to fire. It likely came from a cemetery nearby. Somehow, amid all the chaos, it had ended up buried in their basement. Another mystery inside a mystery. The family search took a stranger turn when they discovered that no one had ever filed a proper investigation into the fire. No inquest, no full forensic report. The state fire marshal had reportedly declined to inspect the site. Instead, the cause had been deemed accidental by a local coroner's jury, based on no physical evidence. And the witnesses, those neighbors and passers-by who had claimed to see the missing Sodder children after the fire, kept speaking up. A woman at a rest stop an hour away said she had seen the children peering from a car's back seat on Christmas morning. A hotel employee in Charleston claimed she served breakfast to 5 children matching their descriptions, accompanied by 2 sharply dressed adults who refused to let the kids speak. In another state, a woman at a children's home said she'd seen them arrive, then vanish weeks later. These weren't dreams or whispers, these were sightings, real enough to send George and Jenny across counties and state lines. Each time they came back empty-handed, dragging with them just a little more silence. To the outside world, they were beginning to look unwell, like people who couldn't let go. But the Sodders didn't want to let go. They couldn't, because every time they tried, the world gave them another reason not to. Then, in 1952, they built the billboard. It stood tall by the side of Route 16, weather-beaten and simple. It featured the 5 children's names and ages, their smiling faces, and a blunt headline, "What was their fate?" It became a landmark, and for many a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't burn with the fire. It smolders, waiting to be uncovered.
The billboard did more than draw attention. It became a symbol. A quiet accusation nailed into the earth, staring out over the roads of Fayetteville like a sentinel. It was Ginny's idea to keep the children's faces smiling on the sign, not somber, not mournful. She said she wanted people to remember them as they were, full of life, caught mid-laughter, eyes dancing with that childlike spark. Not just as missing, not just as lost. Drivers slowed as they passed. Some read, some didn't. But over the years, hundreds of tips poured in. Most were dead ends. Some were strange. A few were terrifying. A woman from Florida sent a letter. She claimed to have overheard a conversation, 2 men talking in hushed tones about a group of children taken from West Virginia during the war years, sold to childless couples, or used for darker purposes. She gave no names, no dates. George drove there anyway. Another tipster, a man from Texas, said he had roomed with a man who confessed late one drunken night to being involved in the disappearance. George went there too. Each trip was the same: tension, hope, disappointment. But they kept going, even as the years dragged on. George began to carry flyers with him, hand-drawn sketches of what the children might look like now if they were still alive. In his aging truck, packed beside tools and spare tires, were posters, notes, maps. He drove for hours across state lines, chasing rumors like fireflies. They flared, they flickered, and then they vanished. Back in Fayetteville, Ginny transformed. She stopped wearing color. Her clothes turned to black, always black, like she was attending a funeral that never ended. At night, she'd sit in her rocker by the window, staring out across the hills. She said she listened for footsteps. She said she'd know if they ever came home. Their surviving children watched it all in silence, siblings who had grown up in the long shadow of loss. They helped when they could, but the weight of the mystery was generational now. Not just about what had happened, but what had been allowed to happen. Because something else was becoming clear. If this was truly just a fire, an accident, why had it been so hastily closed? Why were officials so reluctant to reopen the case? Why had there been no autopsies, no identification, no effort to understand the impossibilities? And why had they been so quick to tell George and Ginny, let it go? The Sodders didn't let go. They held on, even as decades passed.
Because when you lose a child to mystery, closure isn't a destination. It's a decision you're never ready to make.
By the 1960s, the Sodder home had aged, worn by time and sorrow, but the billboard still stood, freshly painted when it faded, maintained like a sacred marker. Jenny and George had both grown older. Their faces were lined with time, but it was their eyes that bore the weight of their unanswered prayers. The world around them changed. New cars, new music, new technologies, but their pain remained anchored in 1945. Then, one day, something arrived in the mail. It was postmarked from Kentucky, no return address, just a single envelope, aged and yellowed around the edges. Inside was a photograph. A young man, early 20s, maybe older. Dark, wavy hair, deep-set eyes, strong features, eerily familiar. On the back, handwritten in strange, blocky script, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ill boys, A90132 or 35. No explanation, no contact information, just that. Jenny and George stared at it for hours. The resemblance was unsettling. He looked like Louis might have looked, as an adult, had he grown up, had he survived. They showed the photo to their remaining children. Some agreed, some hesitated, but there was enough resemblance to fuel the fire all over again. George had the photo enlarged and placed it on the billboard, right next to the 5 younger versions of his missing children. "Is this what Louis looks like now?" the sign now asked. Investigators, those who still paid attention, tried to trace the origins of the envelope. The postmark offered few clues. Kentucky was wide, and A90132 or 35, it didn't match any known code or prison ID. Jenny thought maybe it was written by someone mentally unstable or someone afraid. Maybe it wasn't Louis who sent it. Maybe it was someone with him, someone who couldn't say more. A private investigator was hired. He traveled to Kentucky, chasing down post offices, digging into motel guest books, knocking on doors in rural counties. Weeks passed, and then he vanished. No one ever heard from him again. No report, no calls, no returned fee. Nothing. It was as if the story of the Sodder children was cursed. Anyone who got too close disappeared into its depths like voices swallowed by fog. The family, shaken but undeterred, kept the photo. Jenny hung a copy in her hallway. Every morning she passed by it. Sometimes she said good morning to the image. Other times she paused, stared and whispered, "Where are you?" As the years stretched on, the case grew colder, not forgotten, but transformed into legend. Locals knew the story. Visitors passing through asked about the billboard. The children's names became more than memories. They became questions etched into the town's landscape. Questions with no answers. But answers weren't the only thing the Sodders sought. They wanted truth, peace, a fragment of reality to hold on to in a world that had given them nothing but silence.
The 1970s came quietly. George, now in his 70s, walked slower. His once fiery temperament had cooled, though never extinguished. He still visited the billboard, still scanned the mail with a quiet hope, still picked up the phone at odd hours, just in case it was one of them. A voice, a whisper, a clue.
Jenny had become more reclusive. She rarely left the house except for family obligations or to tend to the flower garden near the spot where the old house once stood. The site had long been cleared, but Jenny had planted roses in 5 neat rows, one for each child. They bloomed every spring, soft petals brushing against the mountain wind like a gentle echo of laughter lost to time. The family dynamics had shifted. The surviving Sodder children were now adults, raising their own kids. But even the new generation grew up under the shadow of the 5 siblings who never came home. Christmases were always a little quieter, birthdays a little more solemn. Every family photo felt incomplete. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. 5 names never spoken without a pause, without a glance toward the horizon. Some in Fayetteville had grown tired of the mystery. They whispered that maybe the Sodders were holding on to fantasy, that maybe the truth was darker and closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. But others weren't so sure. Over the decades, the sheer number of loose threads, lost files, contradictory reports, and strange sightings gave the impression not of delusion, but of something hidden well. And always, the photo remained. That young man's face, claimed to be Louis, now aged and faded behind the billboard's protective glass, stared out at passing cars on Route 16. It didn't blink, didn't change, but it watched. And in its silence, it asked, "Why haven't you found me yet?" George passed away in 1969. Heart attack, sudden and unceremonious. He died without knowing what happened to his children, without closure, without peace. Jenny was devastated. She began wearing only black, a silent symbol of her mourning for George and for the 5 who were never found. She kept the billboard maintained on her own. Help came to repaint it, to change the weathered boards, to realign the photo frames that tilted after storms. She paid them in cash, made them coffee, and told them, if they asked, who those children were. Some listened politely, others grew quiet, haunted by her unwavering belief, a belief that had endured for over 30 decades. Even as her body weakened, Jenny's resolve stayed firm. Every Sunday, she visited the rose garden and left a white stone on each row. 5 stones, 5 tiny memorials. It was no graveyard, but it was something. When Jenny passed away in 1989, it felt like the final curtain had been drawn. She was buried next to George beneath a simple headstone engraved with both their names, and below that, 5 more: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., Betty. No birth dates, no death dates, just names, suspended in time, forever children. The remaining Sodder siblings, now well into their 50s and 60s, stood silently at her funeral. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, only a quiet moment. Each of them lost in their own memories, their own versions of the house, the fire, the chaos. Of the faces they remembered, frozen in youth. After Jenny's death, the billboard, an icon for decades, began to decay. There was no one left to repaint it. No one left to frame the photograph when storms knocked it loose.
No one left to write new messages for the passing drivers. And so slowly it faded, like chalk left out in the rain. One day, someone passing by noticed it was gone. Not replaced, not removed by the family. It had simply succumbed. Nature reclaims everything eventually, even grief. But the mystery, that remained. For years after the billboard disappeared, stories still cropped up. People from distant states claimed they remembered the Sodder case. Some swore they'd seen one of the missing children, now adults, living under new names. A woman in Houston said her mother had confessed, on her deathbed, to raising 2 of the Sodder kids as her own. But the timeline didn't match, and like all the others, the lead drifted into nothingness. In 2005, Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, the one who had been just a baby during the fire, spoke publicly about the case. Now in her 60s, she gave interviews, answered questions. Calmly, quietly. She was the last living Sodder child, and she still believed. She remembered her mother's sorrow, her father's rage, the unanswered phone call that rang that night, the locked ladder, the mysterious truck blocking the driveway, the rumors, the threats. But more than anything, she remembered the photo on the billboard. Louis, or someone who looked very much like him. It haunted her still. Sylvia never claimed to know exactly what happened. She simply said, something wasn't right. That the fire wasn't just an accident. That her siblings deserved answers, wherever they were, whether buried beneath the soil or walking this earth under different names. And so, slowly, even without a billboard, without headlines, without fresh eyes on the case, the story endured. A family torn apart in the dead of night. A fire that defied explanation. 5 children who vanished. And a town that never spoke of it openly, but never quite forgot.
Time moves forward, but memory has a way of lingering, especially in small towns. Fayetteville changed over the decades. New businesses opened, old buildings crumbled. Generations came and went, and for most, the story of the Sodder children became just that, a story. A strange one, a sad one, a puzzle best left untouched. But for a handful of people, investigators, authors, archivists, it remained a chilling cold case worth revisiting. Every few years, someone would rediscover the fire in an old newspaper archive or stumble across the family photo with the 5 smiling children. The same questions always arose. Why were there no remains? Why were the official reports so hasty? And why did so many people around the Sodders seem eager to move on? Curious details, once dismissed, began to feel heavier with hindsight. Like the rumors that circulated in the weeks before the fire. George Sodder had allegedly argued with a traveling insurance salesman who warned him, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." And what of the man who had once scouted the Sodder home under the pretense of looking for work, but had fixated on the fuse boxes? Then there was the woman who claimed she saw the missing children the next morning, peering out of a car window as it sped away from Fayetteville.
Or the waitress who said she served breakfast to a group of restless kids and 2 unfamiliar adults that very day. Details that were vague, unverifiable, and yet strangely consistent. George and Jenny had tried to piece it together. They believed that the fire had been staged, that their children had been kidnapped, perhaps by someone connected to George's vocal criticism of Mussolini and the Italian government. He had received threatening letters in the past. The possibility of retribution was not so far-fetched, especially during the years following World War II. But if the children had been taken, how had no one come forward in all that time? No letters, no phone calls, no hints. Unless the children themselves didn't know who they were anymore. If they'd been raised with different names, in different cities, in homes that fed them new identities, would they remember? Would they want to? Sylvia, even in her later years, wondered this often, not with anger, just a deep, aching curiosity. If her siblings were out there, she didn't blame them for staying silent. She only hoped they were safe, that they had lived good lives, that somewhere, deep inside, a part of them still remembered the Christmas tree in the living room, the soft flannel pajamas, and the sound of their mother's lullabies, and the smell of coal dust clinging to their father's coat. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be.
Jenny Sodder passed away in 1989. She had lived 44 years without answers, longer than she had spent with her missing children. George had gone before her in 1969, still scanning crowds for familiar faces, still chasing rumors that never led anywhere real. When Jenny died, the billboard came down. It had stood for decades along Route 16, bearing the faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, with bold text offering a reward and demanding justice. Drivers passed it daily. Tourists stopped to ask questions. For some, it was an eyesore. For others, a haunting reminder. For the Sodder family, it had been a monument of love, a public declaration that they would not forget. But now, it was time. Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, had grown old. Her voice, once full of the playful tone of a 5-year-old, had matured into the soft cadence of an elder who had seen too much and carried it quietly. She never stopped believing that her siblings might have survived. She kept photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes tucked away in a box, wrapped in the same kind of determination that had fueled her parents for so long. She raised her own family with stories, not just of the fire, but of her siblings' laughter, their kindness, their favorite meals and silly habits. She made sure they were real people, not just lost children frozen in time. And now, as Sylvia reflects in the quiet of her home, she feels both the weight of mystery and the tenderness of memory. The decades have smoothed over some of the sharp edges, but questions still whisper in the dark. What if the fire wasn't just a tragic accident? What if the truth was buried, somewhere in a dusty file or locked behind someone's deathbed confession? And perhaps hardest of all, what if no answer would ever come? But maybe that's not where the story ends. Maybe instead it lingers, in the hearts of those who hear it, in the soft hum of curiosity that stirs late at night, in the wonder of what could have been. The Sodder children may never return, but their story remains. It stretches beyond one night in West Virginia. It lives in the silences, the half-remembered dreams, and the quiet strength of a family who refused to let go. It lives in you now, too. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.
And so we let the lights fade on Fayetteville, West Virginia. The air grows still and the snow that once fell like confetti over a ruined home now drifts gently in your mind, settling on rooftops, fences, and memory. You can still see the outline of the house that once stood, children's laughter echoing faintly in its halls, the scent of pine from the nearby woods wafting through open windows, a mother's voice calling out for bedtime, a father's footsteps on the porch, a family whole for just a moment longer. You let that image linger, because while the fire took wood and plaster, and time took the trail of answers, it didn't erase the love that anchored this story. It didn't erase the faces that smiled from black and white photos, and it certainly didn't erase the quiet defiance of those who never stopped searching. There's something about stories like this. They settle deep, don't they? Not loud or frantic, but like a breeze that brushes the curtains as you drift off, nudging the edges of your imagination. You don't need to solve it. You just need to feel it. And tonight, as the last embers glow in the fireplace of your mind, let it rest there. Let it flicker softly. Let it fade gently. Sleep well.